My name is Dr. Ed Pajor. I'm professor of animal welfare and behavior at the newest veterinary school in North America, one at the University of Calgary. We had our first graduating class this past year. That's how new we are. So I've been there for the last couple of years, and prior to that I was at the Department of Animal Sciences at Purdue University, where a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today was done. It's been recently finished up. Let's talk about some of the research that's been done recently in my own lab at Purdue, and dealing with issues or using approaches of motivation and preference testing. So what am I going to cover today? Some science from my lab, basically. Preference and motivational testing, preferences for space, preferences for flooring, motivation for different housing systems, free access systems and sow use. And I'll finish up with some future directions in housing and some other issues. Now, before we get into the entire area of sow housing, I think we have to take a step back, and I hate doing this because everybody hates the issue of how you define animal welfare. But I think it is extremely important that we do that because there has been a real fundamental change in how animal welfare is being defined. This is a new definition of animal welfare from the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE. Over the last few years, I have seen it appearing in all kinds of different publications, all kinds of different standards, all kinds of organizations have said this is a very good definition and have endorsed that definition, such as the AVMA. Why am I making such a big deal about it? The reason is because it goes through and talks about all kinds of things, about doing good things to animals, making sure that they are fed properly, have good food and water, free from pain, fear, and distress. All this stuff that you've always heard about when it comes to animal welfare. But the real fundamental change is at the very bottom. Animal welfare refers to the state of the animal. Okay? The treatment that an animal receives is covered by other terms such as animal care, husbandry, and humane treatment. Providing food and water is not animal welfare. It is animal husbandry. Okay? It's how you get to animal welfare, but it's not animal welfare itself. It's about what the animals experience, the state of the animal. That is extremely important because I think that is actually going to frame a lot of research going forward in the future, a lot of approaches people are taking with standards and assessments and those types of things, and what people are going to be expecting when they start looking at the type of housing systems you're designing. The type of research that should be done. It's about understanding what the animal is experiencing. It doesn't matter. You walk into a facility, they may have the most up-to-date flooring, the most up-to-date systems you can imagine. Everything seems to be according to the standard, but the animals are all falling down all over the place. Great engineering design, but it's not working for the animals. Again, what the animals are experiencing is going to be the most important part. In order to do that, and we're going to talk about a lot of different issues, or we're not going to talk a lot, we're talking about sow housing issues. We know there's lots of issues in the swine industry, from sow housing, pain management, euthanasia, and transport and other things. Today I'm going to focus on the sow housing issue. And I'm going to focus on it by taking the approach of trying to understand it from the animal's perspective. Okay? Trying to understand animals' choices, animals' motivation. Because again, remember, we've decided, the international organizations have now decided that animal welfare is about what the animals experience. Animal welfare scientists have been saying that for years, but it's now becoming part of a standard appreciation for what animal welfare is. When it comes to the sow housing issues, there are lots of different issues in sow housing. We're going to focus really on gestation sow housing today, but in reality, sow housing is not just this gestation sow housing. Sow housing deals with gestation sows, farrowing crates, and the housing of animals post-breeding. Okay. The housing of animals post-breeding, for the most part, has been left alone in terms of individual housing being appropriate for the implantation period. Okay. There are some questions about if they have enough space, if they have enough things to do, those types of things. Essentially, the issue for all housing systems, for all different stages, is the same. For the most part, industry uses individual housing, limited space, and no enrichment. Okay. The focus right now has been gestation housing, but I don't think that's going to be the only one. Talking about the animal's perspective. How do we try to get inside the animal's head about what's going on? What is it like? What does it not like? How motivated it is to work? The approach that we've taken in my lab is to focus on preference and motivation. Okay? Preference and motivation, you can ask 4 types of research questions with that. Is an animal motivated to obtain or avoid a resource? So we can measure with an animal's motivation for something. Does the animal have preferences when you give it alternatives? Okay. Give an animal a choice. Does the choice it make actually mean something to the animal? Well, we don't know for sure, but we're starting to get an idea that maybe it does. How strong are those motivations or preferences? Is preference or motivation already altered by changes in its internal or external environment? So by providing something in the environment, do you change the motivation that an animal needs for some sort of enrichment, for example? This is kind of the approach, kind of the framework in terms of the scientific work that I'm going to be talking about. Preference motivation testing also has real limitations. Okay? Motivation experiments are extremely difficult to do. There involves a great deal of learning, of training of the animals, of taking these animals through the process of seeing to which point they'll stop working to get access to a particular resource. Do preferences really matter in terms of animal welfare? You give an animal a choice, if it chooses X, is it really good for its welfare, or is it welfare neutral? The example that is often used is an example between, okay, give me a choice between chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream. Okay. I will always pick vanilla ice cream. My son always picks chocolate ice cream. We get along fine. He doesn't touch my ice cream, I don't touch his ice cream. But is my welfare really compromised because, well, if you don't have any vanilla ice cream in the house and you offer me chocolate ice cream, is that a bad thing for my welfare? No. Okay? So it really takes an awful lot of effort to think through what some of these preferences mean. Okay? One of the other issues is an issue that was talked about really just in the last question here about previous experiences of the animals in the transition period. The same thing is true when you're doing these type of research. The previous experience of the animals can have an impact as to what they're going to choose or how hard they're going to get access to something if they've had access to that type of thing before. Okay? And that's one of the questions we asked initially when we looked at the influence of previous housing experience and social rank on sow preferences for different types of sow housing systems. This is a master's thesis done by Lindsay Jones. Lindsay's now working for JBS, I think, down in Kentucky at the moment. And she set up a system where she looked at, we basically give animals, we set up a preference test for these animals. The question we were asking, does previous experience influence the choice of the animal? We took sows from regular gestation stalls, and we took sows from large group pens. That's what they were used to. We then set up a kind of Y maze or T maze experiment where, this is the red light, where animals would walk down a center corridor, they'd be stopped at a gate. If they decided to go to the left, they walked into a free access stall and the gate was closed behind the animal and the animal was locked in. Or if it went to a pen system, they went into a free access stall with the gate left open. So the animals then are making a choice between this additional space plus the stall versus being locked into a free access regular stall. Okay? This is what they actually look like. So this is at the end of the corridor. They would come down to this decision gate. We would open that gate. The animal would look to the right, look to the left, decide which way it was going to go. As I said, these experiments are kind of difficult to do because it involves a great deal of learning. This is just an example of the animal here. There's a set of 3 free access stalls there, and the area behind, that would be the open part. Here you can see the animal going into the free access stall. Gate would close behind her as she walked in, and she'd be locked in there for the rest of the day. There's an awful lot of, like I said, learning, habituation of the animals to these things. Before you can start giving animals free choices, the animals have to know that if they turn right, they get this choice. If they turn left, they get the other choice. Okay? They have to know that that's what's going to happen to them. And so there's a period of habituation where the animals are simply let free to roam around the whole area. So they get used to the whole test pen area. So everything becomes familiar for them for over a 3-hour period. They're just left to walk around. We then do a training day where animals are trained to go to the right and trained to go to the left. I should say trained. They're exposed to both the right and the left. Animal comes down, goes to the right, and gets locked in there. Okay, next time the animal comes down, it goes to the left and gets that experience. So it starts to be trained in terms of what the animals are actually experiencing. We then did test sessions of different trials, and then we did the 8 free trials on the Wednesday. That was a rest day, and then 8 free trials on the Friday. So each animal was tested for free access 16 times. Okay. What do we find out? This is an animal wearing a heart rate monitor. We also put heart rate monitors on these animals. I don't have time to go into that data, but we did a number of other things, not just the choice experiment, but that's what I'm going to focus on. What we found is that group sows, okay, chose the free access stall more frequently than they chose the locked stall. So we distinguish between free access, more space, versus the locked free stall. So you might say that makes some sense. Animals from a group system are picking a group system. It's important to note that animals are also picking the locked stall at times as well. What about animals from a gestation stall? What do they pick? These are the stall sows. And what we found is that for the stall sows, the animals were picking the free access space, this area with more space, more choice, than they were picking the locked area. Okay. The locked area would be what would be considered standard for them. Let me get this right here. This would be the standard gestation stall, essentially. So what we really found is that regardless of the type of housing background, sows demonstrated a clear preference for the free access stall. Okay. Yes, there was some choosing of the locked stall. We don't think it was a novelty approach. That's why we took the time to habituate animals, train animals. We actually think this is an actual choice that the animals were making. And it's not really that surprising that animals don't always choose the free access stall. Okay? It can simply be that animals like to have choices and make choices and like to try different things as well. Why do we think that they were choosing the free access stall? We think it was due to the fact that there was more space, freedom of movement, and the choice that they had. Another way of doing a preference test is rather than setting something up as a t-test with a maze and the animal's training, you can basically set up a situation where you put animals in 2 different environments and see which area they spend more time in. This is a study done by my PhD student who is now at the University of Illinois, Dr. Monica Elmore. And one of the things she looked at in her thesis work was the impact of rubber mats on where animals spend their time. This is the animals in the breeding period, in fact. So basically, the idea is that the standard is bearing concrete flooring. We have incidents of legs and hoof injuries. Lameness tends to be a problem. And there's some indicator that flooring needs aren't being met if we have a large lameness problem, a large injury problem on the slatted floors. Can we change those by actually adding some sort of rubber flooring? This is actually an idea that we decided to test, not because of my brilliance sitting around my desk, but my brilliance by going out and talking to even smarter people, producers, and then saying, you know, one of the things that we do on our farm is we've started putting rubber mats into some of our pens, and it's really helping our incidence of lameness. There's not very much information on that, so we decided to look at that. So the objective hypothesis is to determine the impact of rubber flooring on group house sows, and we were looking at them at 10 days immediately after weaning during the breeding period. The hypothesis that Monica was testing that the addition of rubber mats to feeding stalls and group pens would improve sow health, comfort, and welfare. This is the way the system was set up. We basically, at Purdue at that time, what we were doing, we had 4 pens of sows right after weaning, moved into a pen system with individual feeding stalls. The feeding stall area, in some cases, were a solid concrete floor with a groove floor behind it, a slatted floor behind it. And the other pen was a pen that we put rubber mats down, and again, with the same type of slatted floor behind that. And we had 2 different setups for that. This is kind of what it looked like in real life in terms of the concrete pens and the matted pens. You can see that they're just basic system, but you can see that the rubber matting that was put in the matted pens here. What Monica found was, by simple observations of a number of groups of animals, is that sows really did prefer to rest in stalls with rubber mats. So what we have here is a comparison of the stall area and the amount of the time animals are spending on those matted pens versus in the concrete area without the matted pens. There's significantly more time spent there. And she also found that sows prefer the mats for resting. Compared to all other areas, wherever the mats were, the sows tended to spend much more time on them. So somehow seeming that giving animals rubber mats somehow was of interest to the sows. Perhaps they found it more comfortable. It was important for us to note that it's not possible to have rubber mats everywhere. You still needed some sort of slatted floor. The animals learned very quickly to defecate, urinate in the slatted area and keep the rubber matted area dry. Okay? And they use it primarily for resting. In a similar vein, looking at where animals are spending their time, giving them choices, and looking at environmental design, Lori Mack, who is now at the University of Pennsylvania, did her PhD looking at free access stalls, and the real issue there was looking at different widths. So the idea of having free access stalls requires having an alleyway in the back. Alleyways cost money. How big should those alleyways be? How much space do animals need to be comfortable with those alleyways? Should they be small? Should they be very large? Those types of questions. That's really what she was interested in looking at. So what we found was she decided to look at the pen size. She had 3 different systems set up where we had different widths behind the animal. So these are free access pens with 7 free stalls per each pen. They had a large 3 meters, so 21 feet basically, 9 feet basically of a large area, 6 feet, and less than 3 feet of an alleyway behind. Okay? The idea is if we can get away with smaller spaces, it actually may make it more affordable, might make it easier to convert to those types of systems. This is just an idea. These 2 pictures up here, pictures of the very narrow area, and you can see that animals are actually using those spaces, rather difficult to move around in. This is the middle size. So basically where the animals could actually move by each other quite easily. What do we find in terms of productivity? We found no differences at all depending on how wide those alleyways were. Okay. So she looked at a number of different measures in terms of productivity. For weight weaning estrus interval, you can see the list there. In fact, there was no difference for any of the animals, for any of the groups that we put through the system, depending on how wide that alleyway was. In terms of pigs using the pen, there was a difference in terms of how much animals use the pen. If it was a large space, there was a significant difference in animals being observed in the area 72.8% of the time versus 60% of the time we saw animals in the alleyway. And the medium was somewhere in the middle, right? What we also notice is that depending on the rank of the animals use those pens differently as well. With a dominant animal spending 85% of the time in the group area, and low-ranking animals spending 47% of the time in the area. So we actually went through the process of doing a dominance hierarchy relationship between these groups of 7 animals, determining who was high, who was low, and what animals were in the middle, so we could actually look at the individuals and say, who's spending time out there? And what a lot of producers will tell you is that, surprise, surprise, it's the dominant animal that's spending a lot of time out in that group area, in the big alleyway area. But also surprising, the low-ranking animals are coming out a fair bit as well. They're not spending much time out there, but they are observed going out there. Okay? So they are using it to a certain amount. Those of you who like data on graphs better, you can see here how it changed over time. This is just the treatments in terms of they were kept in the pens for 9 weeks. When we look at the percent time that they spent, you can see that in the large pens, as animals got larger themselves through gestation, they started to use the space outside much more. The small animals are fairly steady because there really isn't a lot of space out there for the animals to move around. The lawyer's conclusion was that space restriction had very little impact on productivity. There were some observations that suggested that having an alleyway space of less than 3 feet was probably not a good idea because it really restricted the animal's movement to be able to pass by each other and use that space, and that high-ranking sows use that space more. A final experiment that Monica was working on was measuring sow motivation for different types of enrichment. So this is how we were actually going about measuring motivation. Animals press a small panel here, and we can change how many times the animal pushes that panel in order to get access to space or some sort of enrichment. Okay? It's kind of the cost that the animal will pay. Okay? If it's something that the animal really, really wants, the animal will press the panel an awful lot of times before giving up. If it's not very important to the animal, press it a few times and really not play with not look at motivation anymore. It's not a very useful resource, or the animal's not highly motivated for that resource. So again, the animal's pushing the panel. We can actually, the number of panel presses is recorded by a computer. We had animals that within a couple of minutes would press the panel a couple hundred times. Basically go in and just... And other animals were less motivated to do that. She looked at dominance and subordinate sows and seeing whether there was any difference in those animals. What happened here is we'd have a test sow, either a dominant or subordinate. She would press the panel a set number of times, the door would open up, and then these other animals would come in and they would have access to this enriched environment of compost and matted floors and a straw hopper to play with, ropes to bite, a number of different things. So really something for the animals to do. Would the animals be highly motivated to gain access to that type of enriched environment, which has lots of things to do? They were motivated to do that. They weren't as highly motivated as they would be for feed, but they were kind of in the middle range in terms of what we think about in terms of their motivation. We often thought that the dominant animal would be more motivated than the subordinate. Why? Because the subordinate, when she goes out here, she has to deal with being the subordinate in a group of three. Right? So being the subordinate is like, well, I'm not really going to go rushing in there and start fighting with everybody else for food because I'm going to get beat up. Okay? In fact, that's not what we found at all. Here's just a picture of the animals in the enriched area. You can see that we've got the straw hopper there. There's a compost here. There's ropes hanging down. This is the rubber flooring here. There's ropes in the feeding stalls as well for them to chew on. So trying to give them lots of things to do. What we ended up seeing is that dominance really didn't make very much difference at all in terms of animals going into that area and using that area. And I think the reason was that there was lots of things for them to do. Right? Even the subordinate animal went in, and if the dominant sow was at the mushroom compost, which is where they usually went to first, she still could go over to the straw or go over to the ropes or some other things. So there were lots of things for them to do, and we didn't really find the difference in terms of dominant status. We also measured the motivation for different enrichments within an individual stall. The idea for that comes from the idea that for animals being housed for breeding purposes are going to be kept in individual stalls. There's already been a number of papers and comments from the European Food Safety Association that is saying, well, you know what? It's okay to keep these animals in individual stalls for the breeding period, but they still don't have anything to do. So could we actually get an idea of if we gave them animals something in the feeding stall, what would they be highly motivated to work for? What we did is we looked at three different major things that we could put into the feeding area. One was the spent mushroom compost, straw in a rack, food in a trough. That's kind of served as the positive control because we know animals are going to be very, very motivated to get access to food, as well as an empty trough, which is the negative control. That was the control against the animals just having fun by pushing the button and getting to go into this additional stall and see what's going on. Right? What we found is that the motivation was high for the mushroom compost, extremely high, much higher than for the straw, but the animals spent a lot of time working with the straw. Right? So Monica's overall conclusions from her thesis work was that they're highly motivated for enrichments in both stalls and group settings. Compost and straw is highly valued. Welfare benefits from that. It really is one of the first studies to look at motivation and look at how it works for enrichments, how it works for access to different spaces, those types of things. Why is that important? Remember, again, that animal welfare is about the state of the animal. Trying to understand what matters to the animal, what the animals prefer, what the animals work for is an important part of moving forward and developing housing systems. Again, welfare is about the state of the animal, behaviors linked to animal welfare. I think Dr. March and Jeremy did a great job kind of outlining the fact that there are all kinds of different issues and that all systems are going to have challenges. There's all kinds of different systems out there. Okay? And I do think that preference and motivational testing shows promise in gaining some insight into the animal's perspective. As a methodology, it has work to do. There's things that we have to do better with it. Okay? But I think it's a really good, important first step. Again, all systems have welfare challenges. Jeremy already outlined a number of other sow housing issues that are going to be there. I think that the research direction is the research direction that has been going on for the last few years, is how to manage alternative systems. A lot of the work that I presented here is funded by the National Pork Board, and the approach has been, if people have to change to alternative systems, what tools are we going to give producers to be successful doing it? That's important in terms of looking forward. I do think the research, again, is going to be framed by that new definition of animal welfare. I think that that new definition of animal welfare about understanding what matters to the animal also reflects what consumers in society are worried about. They're not worried about productivity. They assume producers are already productive. If you're not productive, you wouldn't be in business. They do worry about animal health. But for the most part, I think they really do worry and are concerned. When they're concerned about animal welfare, I think they're concerned about what the animals are experiencing.